kind of interesting having them both in the historical methods class and then in the senior seminar. So they had their real first major class and then their last. And it took me a while, because I don't like to assume anything, but it took me a while to find out that they were dating. And I think when I asked, it was the most obvious question that I could have asked. But anyway, I appreciate that. I'll let them tell you who had the higher grade at the end of the semester.
It was her.
I said guess, John. I wasn't going to give it away. Yeah, today what I want to talk about, tonight what I hope to talk about, is sort of a condensed version of my Florida Civil Rights History class, right? It raises a number of questions often about Florida and its place in what I call the master narrative of the Civil Rights Movement. We think 54, Brown versus Board, to 68. That's when the Civil Rights Movement happened. Not really. Not really. We also think that the Civil Rights Movement only really impacted the Deep South, that those were the real battleground states. Not really. Florida, in my estimation, should not be at the periphery of understanding the Civil Rights Movement, but it should be at the center. Because by looking at Florida, we can understand how state, local, and national campaigns all worked together to both bring racial change and also delay it, right? More so than in any other class that I teach, does it hold the truth to the maxim that the Florida of today is the America of tomorrow. And that's kind of scary when you think about it, but it's true. And when you look at what's happening in Florida historically, it establishes a lot of the elements that we're going to see happen in other Deep South states. So, that's the purpose of this talk, is really to help you understand why Florida should be at the center of how we view the Civil Rights Movement and not at the periphery, because it's important. It seems, though, to contradict outside perception, right? That somehow, let me make sure. There we go. When we think Florida, we think, this postcard's a great example. We think the Sunshine State. We think palm trees. And we've got Cape Canaveral, the Space Coast. We've got the Panhandle, which is a world unto its own. We've got Disney, or Miami, Jacksonville. You don't really think of Florida as being a place that is a part of the South, much less America as a whole, This idea of Florida as somehow different than definitely the rest of the South, and different somehow from the rest of the nation, is a concept that historians call Florida exceptionalism. That somehow Florida, from its very beginning, from its Spanish origins, all the way to today, that Florida is somehow different. It's unique. It's not really part of the South, and it's the weird part of America, right? I mean, we all think about Florida Man, and it's easy to make jokes about how weird the state is for a variety of reasons, or tourist-centered, or beach-related, or open for economic business. Florida's always been open for economic business. That's one of the foundations of the state. However, if you look just below the surface, what you'll see is that in many ways, Florida is unique in patterns of traditional Southern culture. And what that means is that African Americans have been portrayed in Florida as the other, marginalized, not deserving of equal treatment, much less citizenship rights. So we've got African Americans being used in tourism in a comical way or a nostalgic way, right? The old slave market in St. Augustine, where a stereotypical figure is placed in the front of it. And this is used to lure tourists from the north to places like St. Augustine. You want to experience the real South? Come to St. Augustine. Or maybe it is racism and alligators, which is uniquely Florida, right? Maybe it's, as it's called, a darkie's prayer. Reinforcing that Florida's different, but it's not that different. It's not that different. African Americans in Florida still had their so-called place. And it was inferior in all ways to white citizens. We have segregated beaches. We've got the St. Pete Alligator Farm, where black children are portrayed as bait. This reflects the mindset that exists in Florida as the early 20th century began and progressed. Black people are put in the middle of tourism in a way that dehumanizes them. That gets us into the mindset that permeates places like Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. Culturally speaking, then, when it comes to race relations, Florida is definitely a part of the Deep South. If I have a variety of themes that I want people to bring away, and I do, right? I don't want it just to be well, we talked about Florida civil rights, but some themes. How is Florida both like the Deep South? How does it reflect what's going on elsewhere, and why should it be center to the American black freedom struggle? I think one of the first places we have to start is with the violence that permeated Florida. The racially motivated violence that existed in this state was just as nefarious as it existed in other more notorious Deep South states, right? And I think that the first fact that usually grabs people's attention is the fact that between 1890 and 1930, Florida led the nation in per capita lynchings. Between 1890 and 1930, Florida led the nation in per capita lynchings. It was more dangerous for an African American to live in Florida between 1890 and 1930 than to live in Mississippi. That's sobering. So it opens up the questions, why? And what form or forms did the violence take? Well, look, we can look throughout the nation and see that there is politically motivated racial violence because of the fear of a black vote. We see it in 1920 in Ocoee, Florida, presidential election. This was a significant year for a variety of reasons. In Ocoee, due in large part, and this is going to be a common theme as well with Florida civil rights history, because there is such an abundance of land, you do have African Americans, both individually and in communities, that develop a degree of wealth. That doesn't go well with the racial majority who think that that makes one, as they said in the South, uppity. It makes them get out of their so-called place. The next thing you know, they'll want to vote, then they'll want to marry our daughters. And then we've got racial amalgamation, which is the death of the white race. You still hear it proclaimed by racists today. They call it white replacement theory. You're hearing it in American history all the way back at the turn of the century. Well, what happens in Ocoee is you have a large land-owning class of African Americans who were successful farmers and had successfully registered for the right to vote. Their exercising of that right led to a violent white backlash that lasted over 3 days and resulted in, we know of, at least 56 black people slaughtered. 56. You had carloads of white people from Orlando coming to Ocoee as if it were one of the last battles of the Civil War to keep them from voting. Why? There are a lot of reasons here, right? But this is the first election that's held in Florida at the national level after the white primary, as it was called, was declared unconstitutional. So it's going to open the floodgates for the backlash. You have communities that are targeted. Remember, one of the things that I just said that makes Florida kind of unique is the fact that with its spaces, with the land availability, African Americans are segregated. They can't purchase territory in some of the most prosperous places near ports or old productive cotton plantations in Leon County, for instance. But in places like Rosewood, they could develop their own economies. They could develop their own sources of wealth. They could become invested in the railroad industry and the turpentine industry. And because of, this is a common theme as well, where we can see Florida becoming a template for elsewhere, because a white female was having an affair with another white person and is almost caught red-handed, she blames an African-American man for rape. What happens at Rosewood is the culmination of a lot of white frustrations, a lot of white anger, a lot of white resentment and jealousy, quite frankly. And the entire community is besieged. Over a week. Over a week. Families lived in the nearby swamps. People were barricaded in their homes. Others got on trains and went to places like Chicago to never return to Florida again. And that was kind of a point.
Where geographically is Ocoee and Rosewood?
Ocoee is not far from Orlando. It is actually, I would say, about 20 miles outside of Orlando. Rosewood is located near, it's north of Tampa, near Cedar Key. Right,
on the road to Cedar Key.
Not far in the bend, going to the Panhandle. But that's, there are a lot of other factors there that are interesting that explain that. But with every decade, as racial boundaries are being questioned, or at least white control, white dominance is slipping away, you have incident after incident. In 1934, what one historian, James McGovern, said was the last mass lynching in American history occurred in Marianna, Florida. Claude Neal. Claude Neal, again, accusations of rape in prison. A lynch mob is formed, and it actually received national attention. The NAACP began to investigate. This actually launched one of their first major anti-lynching national campaigns, was the lynching of Claude Neal in Marianna. Groveland. If you've ever read Devil in the Grove, this is the story of the citrus industry in Groveland, Florida, and a racist chief of police, a sheriff who is straight out of central casting, named Willis McCall, who ruled Groveland with an iron fist because of the plantation-like orange groves that existed. Another false rape accusation that was later recanted led to the torture, imprisonment, and death sentence for what were called the Groveland Four. While one prisoner was being transported, McCall claimed that they tried to escape. He ordered them out of the car, shot both, killed one was still alive, and testified later that it was a summary execution. So, again, themes and patterns here that characterize much of the Deep South, which we see in Florida, before we even get to the 1950s and the master movement. 1951, Harry T. Moore and Titusville in Mims. which is south of Daytona. Mims, Harry T. Moore, he was not just a voting registration supporter, but he also was the plaintiff in the first successful case of a lawsuit to equalize black teacher salaries in the state of Florida. He becomes an NAACP official, and on Christmas night, 1951, his home was dynamited, and he and his wife became the first NAACP officers in America assassinated because of their civil rights activities. Axe Handle Saturday, Jacksonville. Sit-ins. You were there?
I was there.
So you can probably tell a whole lot more about what happened than anyone else. This both reflects and gives depth into what's going on in the rest of the nation. Axe Handle Saturday came out of the Greensboro sit-ins, February 1st, 1960. They spread like wildfire throughout the South. This is the beginning of the student phase of the civil rights movement, of direct action, nonviolent protest. The police, in conjunction with the Ku Klux Klan and other white terrorist groups, decided that they were going to end it with violence. And literally, axe handles were passed out to a group of men who would then go and attack the people who were sitting in peacefully that day. A lot of these instances, by the way, become sort of lost in time. And I have my theories as to why. I mean, Groveland, for instance, not Groveland. Groveland, I guess, is one example where not a lot was known about it, and when Groveland was emphasized, it was because of Thurgood Marshall's involvement. But it really, scholars overlooked that this is important for Florida's history and the nation's history because it is law enforcement, it is allegations of sexual assault, with unbounded sexual assault, and it is unmitigated racial violence, which, patterns still remain today. But scholars didn't really focus on putting it in the context of how Florida is actually representative of a much greater regional and national problem, and that is the problem of the color line, right? And Axe Handle Saturday was one of those days because so little was known about it. It was not covered in the local newspapers. There are only a handful of photographs that exist. For reasons that are both clear and not clear, it didn't rise to the level of national coverage that some of the other instances that happened in 1960 did. Case in point, St. Augustine. 1964. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Dr. King's organization, came to St. Augustine because they were summoned by local people to St. Augustine. More on that in a minute. Dr. King didn't want to be in St. Augustine. As a matter of fact, he wanted SCLC, after their initial involvement, to tamper down their activities. The reason's simple. The Civil Rights Act was making its way through Congress. In the aftermath of Birmingham, Dr. King said, we don't need any violence to serve as a justification for why the Civil Rights Act can't pass. So we need to keep things on the down low in St. Augustine. It didn't quite work out that way, right? Dr. King was arrested in St. Augustine, the only place in Florida where he ever was arrested during his life. St. Augustine went from being a place that SCLC did not want to invest in to a place where SCLC said we need to use it as an example of what's going to happen to this nation if the Civil Rights Act doesn't pass. This infamous photograph of James Brock pouring muriatic acid into the Monson Motor Lodge swimming pool was the photograph that was on the cover of the Washington Post on the day that the vote to pass the Civil Rights Act occurred. I heard Andrew Young and James McGovern in person talking about how events in St. Augustine were discussed on the floors of the Senate the morning of that debate. It doesn't solidify the fact that it's passed, but it was an example of why that law had to make it through the Senate. Dr. King was in St. Augustine when he learned that it had in fact passed. St. Augustine, according to Andrew Young, was the only SCLC campaign where medical expenses exceeded legal costs. Birmingham, Selma, Albany, Jackson, Mississippi, Atlanta, Georgia, nope. St. Augustine. Miami, 1968. Due in large part to a protest against the Republican National Convention that was being held there. Protests spread to Liberty City. Police are sent in. Violence transpires. 1975 in Pensacola. This is part of my research. And what happens in Pensacola, I think, is very relevant because the issues are no longer segregated facilities. It's no longer laws. It's now practices. It is charges of police brutality against law enforcement who act as if they can kill unarmed black people without punishment because they did. And the presence of Confederate images in local high school. Right? So the movement doesn't end, but it shifts. It shifts from laws to cultural practices. Florida, 1975. Racial violence engulfs Escambia High School because of their school's nickname and imagery. They were the rebels. The Confederate flag was their mascot, and it was used to let African Americans know on their first year of being bused to that school that it was not, as one person told me, it wasn't their school, it belonged to us. I mean, we could keep going. We could keep going into the McDuffie riots in Memphis. We could continue going into what is happening in Florida today. The Florida of today is the America of tomorrow. And you can learn a lot about the state's role in the struggle for racial equality by looking just a little closer at what's happening in local places. The other thing that I'll say that's really important about understanding Florida's role in the national civil rights movement is that the way that the movement progressed in rural areas versus the way that it progressed in urban areas was often very different. And I'll give you a great example. What could the two sit-ins do in agricultural areas? Not much, right? So to understand what the movement for equality looked like in rural areas, what about turpentine, the turpentine industry in Florida? What about the orange, the citrus industry? What about phenomenon like convict labor that Florida practiced like a science? Florida actually, when it came to convict leasing, Florida both took a lot of the more successful elements from Mississippi and did it even better as the 1880s and 1890s turned into the 20th century. What role, and I'll put this photograph here for a reason, and I was really, John was telling me about Manhattan Beach before, what role does tourism play? What role does economic leverage play in the struggle for black equality? These are all fascinating elements that characterize the rest of the South, and indeed much of the nation, that we can see in our own backyards. You can use Florida as a laboratory to understand greater national and regional trends. I'm really fascinated by the economic element, right? As one person told me that I interviewed for my work, people say they see black and white and those are the colors that matter, but the only one that really matters is green. So when you are targeting tourist areas, especially in a place like Florida, that is being advertised as this paradise for visitors, what does that say when it's a paradise only for one race? The political approach. So we've got violence, we've got the urban-rural divide. Now we have the political approach. And here's where I wanted to read a few quotes, because this is important. And I want to get them right. You know, as you can tell, I'm not married to my notes at all. But I do want to get some of these quotes right, because I think this is low-key one of the most important things that Florida does that the rest of the nation soon follows, that the rest of the nation emulates, particularly starting in '68. Richard Nixon's Southern strategy was actually patterned in Florida, right? So, look, let's start with Brown versus Board of Education. With Brown versus Board of Education, we know that that is the beginning of the quote-unquote master narrative. I mean, if you help your kids and grandkids study for a history test and it's the Civil Rights Movement, 1954 Brown v. Board, that's pretty much where you start, if it's not 1955 with the Montgomery bus boycott. Well, what many people don't know is that the first Brown decision had one very glaring error. And that was time frame. When does Brown have to be implemented? The first Brown case didn't answer that. So, the Attorney General for Florida offered the best legal defense, and it became the basis of Brown 2. Brown 2 was released in 1957. The Attorney General of Florida wrote that explanation of a time frame because they knew what it meant. People in Tallahassee understood that delay and stonewall was the way to obstruct Brown. So, what Richard Irvin, who received $10,000 to help prepare this case, said was that for an indefinite timeline, we can request with all deliberate speed. Now, what does that mean? All deliberate speed. Exactly. There were politicians from places like Georgia that said, it took us 300 years to end slavery, and it will take us at least that long to integrate our schools. That's all deliberate speed. Florida literally wrote the playbook for delaying meaningful racial change, even in the wake of monumental Supreme Court decisions. For me, one of the interesting things here that does become an example of stonewalling and delaying is the Florida Pupil Assignment Law. Now, I wrote about this a little bit in my book, right? The Florida Pupil Assignment Law was a state law that was meant to circumvent even the all deliberate speed. This is what the Pupil Assignment Law said. It was passed in 1956. So what it does, number one, is that it basically said there's not going to be one state law when it comes to how pupils are assigned to schools. Instead, we're going to allow the county to decide. Okay? This is really important because it's a tactic that's still used today to delay and complicate meaningful racial change. We're going to let the county decide on a case-by-case basis. So therefore, if there's going to be an appeal, you had to go through the local, the state, and then the federal. It just delayed it, it draws it out, it throws up obstacles. This is how, in the wake of Brown, Florida ruled that students would be assigned, quote, local school boards must consider the sociological, psychological, and other social scientific factors as will prevent socioeconomic class consciousness among pupils in determining student assignment. School boards should consider, quote, the scholastic aptitude, intelligence, and mental energy or ability of pupil. It's wide open. It means everything and nothing at the same time. It gave the power of the school board for any reason whatsoever to deny school assignment of of an African-American family to a predominantly all-white school. And oh, by the way, it put the pressure on the African-American family to actually apply, to put their kids and put their families through all this. And you know what? The result is called tokenism. A select few children whose families are financially secure and brave enough to actually go through this process are the ones that are assigned. For instance, that's 1956 with the pupil assignment law. It's 1961, there's only one integrated school district in all of Florida. Orchard Villa was the first to integrate 2 African-American children. Within a year, it was all black because white parents had pulled their kids out of the school.
Where was that located?
Miami, Dade County. Dade County. Leroy Collins, for me, the political approach here, and this is who I thought of when I mentioned Nixon's Southern strategy. Leroy Collins is, the big biography about him is titled Floridian of the Century, right? And Leroy Collins is often championed as this figure of racial moderation because he said that he personally opposed segregation. Well, he personally opposed segregation in March of 1960. His term was up in November of that year. He had blamed the NAACP for, quote, forcing the issue on white people of school integration. All he said was that, and this, again, you put it in context, and March of 1960 is during the period of the sit-ins. Civil rights is becoming a national issue. And Collins says, quote, that he represents all people of Florida, whether that person is black or white, whether that person is rich or poor, or whether that person is influential or not influential. That was it. That was it. He said he represented all Floridians. Because of that, he has a reputation as a racial moderate. Well, I guess compared to George Wallace, who doesn't appear to be a racial moderate? But those are the comparisons. You got Ross Barnett in Mississippi, who's calling out the National Guard to prevent James Meredith from attending classes, right? So the fact that he is championed as this moderate in the Florida oasis of the Deep South, even though the policies did nothing, meant that in image, Florida remained exceptional. The 1968 results, I think, is where we have gone to the point of no return to a degree. And what I mean by that is that behind all of these political maneuverings and such, keep in mind that African Americans are voting Democrat. And the reason that they're voting Democrat is not because of the state level. They're voting Democrat because of the national level. Starting really with JFK, right? JFK's policies, and then definitely Lyndon Johnson's. So Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society, War on Poverty, okay. Southerners had always been the party, the Democrats had always been the party of the white South as well, right? As a matter of fact, in the South, they were called Yellow Dog Democrats. If the Yellow Dog ran, it would win if it were a Democrat. Well, what happens as more African Americans begin to vote Democrat? What happens when LBJ signs the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act? Well, the rest of the South is going to see a mass exodus of white voters from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. It happens, but what political scientists and historians say is that 1980 is the big year. That's the year where everything changed. Yeah, you saw it a little bit in 72 and 76, but 1980 with Reagan is really when the white South went Republican and has not returned. In Florida, though, in 1968, the presidential election, the Republican candidate was Richard Nixon. The independent was George Wallace. In 1968, in the state of Florida, George Wallace and Richard Nixon received 70.5% of the popular vote. 70.5% of the popular vote went either Nixon or Wallace. The Florida of today is the America of tomorrow. But it's not just a story of victimization. It's not just a story of despair. I think one of the things about the Florida movement that is most impactful is that you see themes of black resistance to racism from the very beginning. And look, I said this at an event in St. Petersburg. One of the themes that connects African American history from the arrival of people of African descent here until this very day is resistance. Constant resistance, constantly asking for the nation to live up to the ideals that it's established for all, even before those ideals were articulated. You see this throughout Florida. Harry T. Moore, despite threats against his own life, he knew that Christmas was a time where his family would be home, and he sent his daughters away. He and his wife were murdered. This was a person that was told by the NAACP, you're getting too close to bringing violence on yourself, and that makes our organization look bad. So they cut ties with him, right? But he still forms Progressive Voters League of Florida. You've got people like C.K. Steele, who was the vice president of the SCLC when it was formed. He was in Montgomery, and before the Montgomery bus boycott even ended, he came back to his home in Tallahassee and started a bus boycott there, using students from Florida A&M as some of his foot soldiers. You can see Reverend Steele standing with a burning cross on the front of his church lawn. In the 70s, you have people like H.K. Matthews, who, even though he was told black people need to be content, you've got integration, why are you protesting policing? Why are you protesting Confederate images? He's still doing what he can to bring attention to the situation in Northwest Florida. The list goes on and on and on. Mary McLeod Bethune, the namesake of Bethune-Cookman. Student protests in Tampa. No, that's actually Tallahassee, I'm sorry. At a movie theater. They had a watch-in where they went to the movie theater, bought tickets, and wanted to exercise their right to watch a movie that they were told was not your theater. Andrew Young, Martin Luther King, Robert Haling. Robert Haling was the reason in St. Augustine that Martin Luther King and SCLC came to the city. So yeah, we can look at violence, and we can look at the urban-rural divide, and we can look at the political obstacles that are put in the way of black people demanding their equal rights. The other thing we have to do as well is look under the surface again to see that it's black activism that prevented total hopelessness from befalling entire communities. So the importance, before we get to questions, I always like to end any conversation, any lecture with things to think about, right? What are the importances? And for this, there are really three things that I think are relevant today. And that is, first, the civil rights movement is much more complex than we often comprehend. As Reverend Matthews told me once, civil rights movement is not a story of all white people are bad and all black people are good. As a matter of fact, African Americans in middle class or upper middle class positions often believe that others rocked the boat for them, and they were not people who supported general campaigns. On the other hand, in places like Miami and places like Tampa, immigrant communities would support civil rights. you have some white people who do advocate for racial change. It's much more complex than we often understand. You can see that by studying Florida on its own. Second thing is that perception often means more than reality. It's the perception of Florida as progressive, tourist-based, not really part of the South, the Florida exceptionalism. We were talking a little about perception and what I call definitional theft before this presentation even began. But the idea that the state has often put its standing in the rest of the nation before actual humanity is worth considering. At what cost are we advertising, quote unquote, the free state of Florida? What's the human cost for that? What's the cost for people for whom the American dream is not accessible? Finally, I think it raises questions about the difference between desegregation and integration, right? And this goes back, circles all the way back around to how I started the conversation by saying, the movement doesn't start at a certain date or end at a certain date. It's a constant struggle. There's resistance before 54, and there continues to be a movement here and now to address these racial discrepancies. Desegregation is simply the integration of public spaces. But true integration is incorporating all citizens equally within our communities, our state, our schools, our churches. I think studying Florida then is really important, because instead of placing it at the periphery of the South, you actually can understand the complexities that the entire nation faces and the challenges that are still with us and will only be front and center as the next few years progress.